talk about, first of all, the scientific way of knowing. We are in the development of theories and hypotheses. This view, if we may put out the lights, perhaps. This is a view of Rainbow Bridge in Utah, and on the basis of geological studies, we know that these rocks are of Jurassic age in the middle of the Mesozoic era, basis of fossil life forms that are found in these rocks. On the basis of a number of studies over the decades, it has been determined that there are a series of rock formations that can be deciphered, and these have been built up on a basement of Precambrian rocks. At the time that these were deciphered, it was not known what the absolute age was, but it was recognized that the Paleozoic sequence of strata contained marine fossils in certain of the layers, and these could be correlated with other fossils and could be related to Cambrian through Permian age layers of rock elsewhere. Years ago, we did not know exactly how old the Earth was or what the precise date was to the base of the Cambrian, to the base of the Paleozoic, for instance. But on general considerations, it was recognized that in order for this to be accomplished, there had to be a great interval of time allotted to this process. The Mesozoic sequence was built up, and some of you have certainly seen some of these beautiful national parks, Grand Canyon, Zion Canyon, built up in the Mesozoic rocks, these rocks that contain dinosaurs among others, and the Cenozoic that includes Bryce Canyon, for instance. So around the globe, studies had been carried on and with confidence that progressively there was an understanding of the buildup of the layers that comprise the Earth, and they were so classified, but without modern understanding of the absolute age dates that they represented. Lord Kelvin, in a AAAS meeting in 1896, for instance, categorically asserted that the Earth could be no older than 50,000 years. And he based that on some solid studies that he thought would stand the test of time, namely that the heat budget in the Earth could represent no greater interval than 50,000 years. At that same meeting, one of the geologists from the University of Chicago made a protest, namely that perhaps there are materials in the rocks that we do not know yet how to analyze that will provide us someday with an understanding of the absolute age of the Earth. Well, it turns out that that was in fact the case, and it was the same year that Madame Curie and others had done some of their pioneering work on radioactive mineral decay. Other fossils, such as these trilobites from just south of Boston, represent rocks that are of Cambrian age, and they represent rocks, moreover, that are typically found with such life forms in Europe. Dinosaur footprints from nearby here in the Connecticut Valley represent, in the early days of learning about these rocks, they were thought to represent gigantic bird tracks, and some of the early names reflect that bias until they found bones that went along with them. So that gradually there were improvements in our understanding of these animals as reptiles rather than birds, and the classification of these went on so that we developed a systematic classification through time, through the Mesozoic, of these important reptilian life forms. And on the basis of biological studies, these were then classified. This data over time was put together, and on the basis of some radioactive dating methods, we now can assign dates to the rocks in which these fossils are found. And now all of the major life forms are represented as having the earliest yet discovered fossils. For instance, the fishes in the latter part of the Cambrian, around 535 million years, and amphibians approximately 350 million years, and so on up to reptiles, birds, and mammals, with a suggestion as to their linkages to other life forms in an evolutionary scheme. This book by Charles Darwin on the origin of species in 1859 essentially crystallized what had been a growing concern over the years among people who honored the Bible and looked to the Bible as essentially an infallible document, a document that whose reading was considered by many to be read literally. Darwin, himself a religious man and who had studied for the ministry, recognized the problem that the publication of his theory on the basics of evolution would cause, particularly in the philosophical community and in the religious community. But nevertheless, this started the ball rolling, and we have, in the meantime, had to grapple with these very important questions that face the religious community on the basis of the Bible and how we should interpret the Bible. And what kind of standing does the Bible have in terms of the book of nature, so to speak, in terms of what is described there? My colleague, Father Jim Ring, and I went to look at this boulder in the nearby town of Weston, where I do my work at Weston Observatory. In the last century, many such blocks of rock, granite sitting on volcanic materials, were found in a number of different parts of New England by the geologist, the Reverend Edward Hitchcock, president of Amherst College in the mid-1800s. And one of the ideas that had been brought forth repeatedly was that the only explanation that they could come up with for such blocks of rock as this that were clearly out of place, didn't belong there, was that they had been deposited in Noah's deluge. Gradually, however, with exploration going on in various continents, such as the Antarctic and in Switzerland, deposits that had been laid down by the glacier were recognized as quite capable of depositing big blocks of rock such as we see here. The elder of the two Agassiz, a professor at Harvard, came over from Switzerland, and one of the first things that he did when he got off the boat in Nova Scotia was to dash out into the countryside to see if he could find any evidences of glaciation. So over the centuries and decades, we have gradually come to understand some of these various features that in times past had only explanations that could be approached through considerations of the Bible. We now have maps such as this that show the maximum extent of glaciation during the past million years. And if we look at Greenland and the Antarctic today, we know that that glaciation, that we're still living in a glacial age. And a visit to Boston can perhaps only confirm that. So we have a clock here then that indicates that the Earth is 4.6 billion years, 4,600 million years old. And that date is now, it's a radioactive date out of Caltech that has stood the test for about 25 years. And so that we won't go into any details about this particular chart, but I show it to suggest that we have a problem here. When we look at what we learn from geology and other sciences, and what we learn from the book of Genesis. And for those of us to whom, or for whom the Bible is an important document and a revered document, I felt that it was rather important that we put down some guidelines then as to how we should approach our approach the book of Genesis, and how we should approach our scientific work, and ways of knowing about the book of nature and the book which is what the Bible means. It is the book. I'd like to clearly distinguish then between the book, the Bible, and the book of nature, and how we go about understanding what is contained therein. If we take a chart that is a time chart that is derived solely from the Old Testament, a great number of estimates have been made by scholars of the Bible who were interpreting the Bible in a literal fashion. And this chart is available in my publications, including this Modern Science in the Book of Genesis. But basically, an average of the ages that can be constructed from a literal reading of the Old Testament indicate that from Adam to the birth of Christ occupies an interval that is around 4,000 years. And if we add 2,000 years to that, then the age of the earth, derived only from that literal understanding of the Bible, brings us up to 6,000. Most fundamentalists, including the creation scientists, will stretch that a little bit to 10,000 years. But the focal point of discussions with creation scientists has a sticking point on the age of the earth and on the possibility of evolution. Those are two very critical considerations. So clearly then, from the point of view of knowing about the earth using scientific method, we come to vastly different conclusions than if we use Genesis as a textbook of science. And my claim is that the book of Genesis, the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament, we should look on that as a religious document and not as a scientific document. It presents the worldview that was, just as we scientists have a worldview that is based on science, so too all primitive peoples have had a worldview that was consistent with what they knew about the universe and about the earth. But the authors of Genesis were not writing a textbook in science. they were writing a history of the Jewish people and the interactions that they had with God and God had with them. It was their idea of God was a personal God. And I think that we can relate to that, and one of the reasons in writing this book was to try to furnish to teachers and to individuals a solidly founded academic approach to not especially to the science, but because that needs no elaboration, but to the question of how to interpret what is said in the first book of Genesis particularly, and especially with regard to the creation and to the flood. These are really very serious sticking points in any consideration of how we should interpret the Bible. What I've done is to break down the primitive history that is described in the first 11 chapters of the book of Genesis, because that is really a key to understanding what this kind of literature represents. And the other three divisions, the narration with regard to the patriarch Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and the history of Joseph, which are very heartwarming and very interesting narratives. Nevertheless, they are more properly classified as being close to history. These are sort of like sagas. But I'll come back to these letters over here on the right, because that will become important. But I just want to give you an idea of the focus that we're going to be developing. Namely, how should we interpret the creation of the world and man, the creation of man and woman? And these two narratives are actually, if we were trying to analyze these scientifically, they are actually two different accounts. They are in no way consistent with each other in their details. But that did not bother the author of the book of Genesis for his purposes, which was clearly a religious intent, and that is something that in the teaching of in the teaching of science, and in any attempt to either for our own benefit or for the benefit of students, that we should clearly distinguish between what is science and what is not science, what is a religious writing and what is a scientific writing, because that's really the only way that we can clearly distinguish the logical features in this dilemma. Now, this is a picture of Noah's Ark, and a Jesuit colleague of mine from the 1600s, who was a fairly good geologist, set about to try to resolve in his own mind whether or not the narration in the book of Genesis with regard to the flood was meant to be a historical event or not. So he set about designing this 450-foot boat on the assumption that that was about the dimensions of 300 cubits. And he designed 3 floors in this boat, 3 decks. Athanasius Kircher lived between 1602 and 1680, and he was a professional geologist, as I am, and an Egyptologist, as I am not. But he counted up the number of animals that would have to be accommodated in the ark, and he came to the conclusion that there were about 310 kinds. So he wanted to see if these would fit into the ark, and he designed this ark, and he concluded on the basis of his investigations that they could fit in the ark. And therefore he interpreted at that time the ark as as the narrative as being suitable to be interpreted in a literal fashion. However, in the next century, Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern taxonomy, who lived just about 100 years later, investigated and found that there were 15,000 kinds of animals, and he himself was a religious man, but he recognized that the ark was getting too crowded by this stage, and that some other interpretation obviously was the answer. Present-day taxonomy recognizes, as I understand it, approximately 30 million species, and this is clearly, there was no ark big enough to accommodate all of them. Now, let's go back then, and we see that biblical scholars over the last 2 centuries have analyzed particularly this very thorny issue of the primitive history, and we should actually almost put quotes around history because it is not history in any sense of the word. This is a unique form of literature, and we need to look at it as literature, and not only the writing of one individual, but a composite document that has a number of different authors. Fundamentalists, particularly the creation science school, would hold that essentially the Bible was dictated by God to a scribe who wrote it down word for word. On the other hand, biblical scholars are now unanimous, except for those who are writing for creation science, that the Bible is composed of several different components, and we'll come back to this, but for instance, the first narrative concerning the creation of the world and man in the first chapter of Genesis, going over a little bit into the second, was composed by, was put together as what is called a priestly tradition. The priests in the temple at Jerusalem were the principal authors of that narrative after the Jews had been brought back from captivity in Babylon. Whereas the creation of man and woman is what is referred to as the Yahwistic tradition, or it is a part of Genesis that is clearly identifiable as written in very ancient times. The name for God was Yahweh, as opposed to some other names for the supreme being that is mentioned in some other parts of the book of Genesis. So clearly then, there are a number of different traditions, essentially we might say documents, that can be distinguished. And briefly, I'll just run over a couple of the important attributes of each of these, such that they can be recognized by biblical scholars. And in your own reading of the English translations, you may be able, I'm sure you will be able, to recognize certain of the major characteristics. The Yahwistic tradition uses the ancient divine name Yahweh. The parts of Genesis that are recognized here, and this would apply also to the first 5 books of the Old Testament, the Pentateuch or the Torah. These are attributed to a Judean writer who wrote these down in the 10th century during the reign of Solomon, 960 to 920 BC. It forms the narrative framework of the book of Genesis. It is vivid, it's colorful in its style, and it has anthropomorphisms. For instance, it pictures God, who is a spirit, as a human being who walked in the garden with Adam and Eve. Another document that does not form as big a part of Genesis is the Elohistic tradition. And the divine name Elohim means something more like the force or the power, as opposed to a more personal name, Yahweh. It also has a distinctive vocabulary and therefore can be recognized, a somber style. Man's relation to God is distant rather than the close relationship of Adam and Eve to Yahweh in the garden. God remains invisible, speaking from a cloud of fire or in dreams or through angels. The priestly tradition. This is a very important one because it is attributed to the priests in Jerusalem and developed, the material was developed during the captivity or the exile in Babylon, which was a 50-year period from 587 to 538 BC. The priests developed basically what is our present book of Genesis and the Pentateuch, and they imposed the order and the system on Genesis in chapter 1 and throughout. The liturgical and legalistic bias is very evident in the priestly writings. The laws that were laid out, and the word Torah in Hebrew means the law. And by these, they codified Israel's cultic and moral traditions. And for instance, the creation and the flood stories were developed by the priests. And you can see that this is relatively late in the story, rather than being one of the earliest traditions. And this is an affront to many of the creation scientists who believe that only Genesis has a creation and flood story. But we know that there are many flood and creation stories. Practically every civilization has them. The covenants and God's revelation of self to mankind are also brought in by the priests. And this has a liturgical and a religious meaning that is meant to indicate that God is a forgiving God, and that she is made a covenant with mankind not to destroy the world by flood and so forth. Now, the final player in this composition of the sources of Genesis, who put them together in their final form by the year 400 BC. We believe that it was by 415 BC, but certainly by 400 BC, we have the ancient Hebrew manuscript that is still extant. So the final editor of the Pentateuch was the person or group of persons called the redactor, the redaction tradition. And the ideas that are stressed in this manuscript are mainly those of the Yahwistic and the priestly tradition, with lesser content of Elohim to follow. This is referred to by many people as the documentary hypothesis. It is an abhorrent to creation scientists because they wish to interpret the Bible as one document dictated by God himself. This is merely what I have been telling you here with regard to the documentary hypothesis, put in graphic form. We have the ages on the left with Solomon, as we've indicated, and we've shown by the solid yellow line that this particular tradition was fixed in writing, and it came down and was combined with the Elohistic tradition, which was developed in northern Israel, whereas the Yahwistic tradition was developed and written down in the south of Israel. By the year 721, there is evidence to show that the Yahwistic and the Elohistic traditions were combined, and these two were then further combined with the priestly tradition after the return of Israel from Babylonian captivity. And then finally, the redaction was complete by, certainly by the year 400. We haven't said anything about Deuteronomy, and that is similarly linked. Now, what about the creation narrative? In the last century, between around 1838 and 1875, a number of these stone tablets were found in the library of Ashurbanipal in Babylon. And this is an account of the Babylonian creation story. Enuma Elish is the term that's used. And one of the remarkably interesting things for biblical scholars is the strong similarity and yet the notable differences between the creation myth, as it's called, of Babylon. And there are a number of gods that are talked about, Marduk and others. But then when you come down to creation, the topics that are treated in Genesis are systematically the same as those that are treated in the Babylonian creation story. So clearly, during the time of the Babylonian captivity, the priests of Israel and the people of Israel became very familiar with these stories, this storyline of creation. And because of its familiarity, it was incorporated, evidently, by the priests in the Temple of Jerusalem as a storyline. But if we were to turn back to that previous slide, we would note that the theology is very different. The Babylonians have a polytheistic theology, whereas Israel has a single God. And so that the priests in the Temple of Jerusalem used the familiar storyline, but they used it as a polemic to put forth their own theology about the one God and all of the other attributes of their God, by contrast with the attributes of the Babylonians. So clearly then, we must look at the book of Genesis as literature. It is a composite book that uses, as all authors do, materials of all sorts drawn from a number of different sources. For instance, the Enuma Elish then is a Babylonian creation story and is a vehicle for the Genesis message. And the first 11 chapters of Genesis are composed of a variety of literary forms: myth, legend, and folklore, patriarchal stories that resemble sagas, ancient creation stories, genealogical lists, songs, proverbs, legends, customs, institutions, and idioms. So the main message of Genesis is a religious message. The book of the first 5 books of the Genesis, the Pentateuch, carries a religious message. The worldview of the day is basically incidental and has been gathered from all sorts of folklore. They were not concerned with geology or biology or whatever as we know it. Chapters 12 to 50 are like sagas, and they are based on history, but they are not, strictly speaking, history. One of the interesting points is that archaeology suggests the underlying social, juridical, political, geographical, and religious conditions in Genesis are those of the 2nd millennium BC, particularly with reference to the Yahwistic tradition, wherein Abraham is described. Abraham, as we now are pretty sure, lived in the Bronze Age between around 1200, around 1800 BC. And so that all of the internal evidence of the literature plus archaeological data suggests that the older parts of Genesis are properly situated here in this period of time, and the Iron Age comes down to the beginning of to the fall of Jerusalem and the beginning of the captivity in Babylon. So this then is a bit of a summary of what we have just said, and each of the various elements that are contained in this primitive history can be assigned to either composite priestly and Javistic traditions or to a single one of these. You will note, however, that the religious emphasis is dominant throughout as attributed to the priests in the Temple of Jerusalem. Let me conclude with that, but I think it's important for us as scientists to be able clearly to, and as science teachers, to clearly be able to distinguish between what is science and what is religion, and to recognize that those people who do not have an understanding of Genesis as literature and who feel threatened by both their literal interpretation of the Bible, because they don't know how else to interpret it, and by the findings of science, which more and more differ, of course, from the primitive worldview, that they find themselves more and more in confusion and turmoil, and blind themselves really to science. We have in Henry Morris, who is the leader, one of the leaders of the creation science controversy, has said repeatedly, and this has been repeated by some of our national leaders, that essentially all science can be found in the Bible. This is clearly not the case, and neither scientists nor biblical theologians would countenance such a conclusion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Reverend Skehan. There might be time for a question or two.
Yeah, I'd like to ask, you know, maybe my information is out of date or whatever, but some of the things that I've heard about the Aloistic tradition. First of all, I understand that the opening sentence of Genesis is part of that tradition, that in the beginning Elohim created the heaven and the earth, and that Aloistic tradition has been interpreted by some scholars to mean that it's a plural of gods, that it isn't one God, but God in the plural, and that other references in the same section indicate things like let us go down and speaking of in the plural form. And is it possible that the Aloistic tradition relates to a polytheistic period of Hebrew history?
It's not my understanding that it does, but there are, I know the point that you're referring to, and I must say that I don't, although I studied a little bit of Hebrew in the seminary, I can't verify firsthand whether this is the case or not. I think we'd have to refer to biblical scholars and whatever. I'd abide by whatever they say with regard to that. Yes.
One more question?
I wanted to say something about the 30 million species of organisms.
Uh-huh.
That is an estimate of the total number. The actual number that have been named is about 1 million. That number includes all the plants and also all of the sea creatures. It's based on some research by Terry Irwin at the Smithsonian, and it's very well-based research. I mean, probably it's about 30 million, all right. Of that, the great majority of the organisms included are terrestrial land organisms, so mostly insects. By the way, at the Brookfield Zoo, it takes 35 people, that's just people working directly with the animals. I mean, no, one person per ratio of people taking care of animals is one person to 35 animals. I can find that out one day.
If I were to revise that slide, what figure would you put in there?
Why don't you...
as eligible for going on the ark.
Call Terry Irwin at the Smithsonian.
Okay.
I don't know it offhand.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you very much,
It's,
Reverend
it's,
Skehan.
it's over half of that figure. It's well over 15 million.
Very good. Thank you.
And now, our final speaker of the afternoon is Dr. Carl Fieser, who is the editor for our newsletter, Evolution and Creation newsletter. Sorry, I get that wrong on the chance. Creation Evolution newsletter. And he's going to address us on why the expression, the scientific worldview, is incompatible with the universal nature of science.
You all must be pretty saddle sore by now, and I promise that this will be relatively, at least, brief. In fact, it should be brief because I feel that every one of the previous four speakers that is taken collectively have ineffectively scooped me. So you have been handed now, I think, a document, and I'm rather shamelessly soliciting. Well, we had commercials earlier today, and this is another one. In this case, I'm shamelessly soliciting help, and this sheet is intended to reveal to you what I'm soliciting help about. My remarks form part of the argument of a book called Science, Religion, and Your Private Beliefs that I'm in process of writing, and what you have in front of you is a synopsis of the argument of that book. It deals with a wide assortment of topics, scientific, historical, and philosophical, and I need critical readers who are expert in appropriate fields. And as I indicated at the beginning of the sheet, if after reading the synopsis you think that the project has merit and would be willing to serve as a critic, I invite you to contact me here or at home. The title of my paper asserts that the expression, the scientific worldview, is incompatible with the universal, and the word should be intent, the universal intent of science. Now that judgment sounds very definite and unequivocal, and I do want to qualify it a little bit. Yeah. Okay. 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 Well, we have just been notified that we need to vacate the room immediately, and therefore I simply ask you to read the synopsis, and indeed many of the points that I was going to make are in the synopsis. So.